Now, if you want to read a bit more about what I'm going to tell you now, you can read this paper in Nature Reviews Neuroscience, which came out a few months ago. Any of you read it? Okay. I guess that's why you come here. This is the distilled essence. So I'm going to start with LSD. Now, these two people got the Nobel Prize for Physiology of Medicine. These are the two most important Nobel Prizes in the history of medicine, unquestionably. The double helix, the key to life, and Harry Mullis, the PCR reaction. The PCR reaction is what tells you whether you're eating kangaroo meat in your beef burgers or not. And Kerry Mullis is a great protagonist for the use of LSD by scientists because he said, I saw the PCR reaction whilst I was taking an LSD trip. Francis Crick took LSD after he discovered the double helix, and he changed from being a molecular biochemist to being a brain scientist. In fact, he left the UK because the police were getting onto him and he didn't want to get arrested. And so he moved to Arizona where people were a bit more relaxed about psychedelics, and he spent most of his life there. But these two are very powerful intellects who valued the contribution that psychedelics made to their intellectual development. And I think they would subscribe to this comment of Einstein's. No problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. And certainly Kerry Mullis would have said that without LSD we wouldn't have had the PCR, and the world would be a very different place. In fact, LSD was made available by the company that invented it, Sandoz, specifically because they saw it as a major tool for understanding the brain and also helping people. And while it was legal until the early 1960s, there were about 1,000 clinical papers, 40,000 patients, 40 books. There was a lot of work done on LSD. And the results were reported as generally positive and often showing effective treatments. And here's an example. Here's an example of a recent publication of a meta-analysis of 6 LSD and alcoholism studies, which were conducted back in the 50s and 60s. You can read the review there. So they applied modern meta-analytical techniques to these old data. And they showed that the effect size of LSD in the treatment of alcoholism was the same as, well, better than any current therapy. And in the 50 years since the drugs were banned, there have been no studies. No clinical studies at all. There's been one research study, which was a very small numbers. And you say to yourself, well, why have we denied patients with alcoholism, or maybe other addictions, access to a therapy which could be better than what we have? Why have we done that? And the answer is because the Drug Enforcement Agency in America said we should. And this goes back to the Vietnam War, and the fear that LSD would change social thinking to a point where American youth would refuse to go and fight. And whether that was a likely effect of LSD, I don't know, but it was banned. It was banned based upon a collection of stories, exaggerated stories about the harms of LSD, which were used to justify the ban. And it was banned in the face of opposition from the government. And this is really what's chilling about this story. Because here's Bobby Kennedy, would have been president if they hadn't shot him, and the probably most powerful man in America at the time, Secretary of State. He said, why, if clinical LSD projects were worthwhile 6 months ago, why aren't they worthwhile now? We keep going around and around. If I could get a flat answer about that, I'd be happy. Is there a misunderstanding about that question? And of course, there's no misunderstanding. But the power of the drug legislators to stop people behaving rationally, thinking rationally, was so great that even the Secretary of State couldn't overrule it. And since then, there has been no research. And I would contend that this is probably the worst example of research censorship, certainly in modern times. I can think of only one worse example in the whole history of mankind. And that's this one. And this is when the Catholic Church banned the teachings of Copernicus. He discovered that, contrary to church teaching, the sun didn't go around the earth went around the sun. And when Galileo confirmed that, Galileo was threatened to recant or be burnt, and he decided to recant. Bruno got burnt, And the writings of Copernicus were banned for 150 years. So I would contend that the banning of research on drugs, illegal drugs, has been the worst example since then. 50 years in which we've done virtually nothing. Now, you all know about the therapeutic benefits of cannabis, as you know, certainly in some parts of the world they're being liberated. Cannabis was made illegal in the UN conventions in 1961, despite it having been a medicine in most countries for several thousand years. But other treatments, other drugs like ecstasy, psilocybin, LSD, and even methadone and naphthalene, drugs which have recently been banned in the UK, these are all being developed as potential treatments. And they get banned because young people use them, without any awareness, seemingly, that they might have therapeutic value. And once they're banned, studying them is almost impossible. So I'm going to tell you about what we've been trying to do to change that. Because it seems to me this is truly an outrageous imposition of prohibitionists on science. And it's a terrible limitation to possible therapeutics. So we decided a few years ago to challenge this, and we started using psilocybin. So psilocybin, magic mushrooms, a short-acting psychedelic, similar in pharmacology to LSD, works on the 5-HT2A receptors in the brain. And these receptors are distributed through the cortex. So these receptors have evolved in parallel with the evolution of the human brain. We do not know what they do, but we do know now that stimulating them with psychedelics produces the psychedelic experience. It's this alterations in consciousness and perception that these drugs produce. And having done this first experiment, we discovered something which was completely unpredicted. No one could have imagined that when you have a psychedelic experience and you see a whole myriad of wonderfully coloured different shapes moving in front of your eyes, that your brain is actually switched off. We all assumed that hallucinations would be associated with increased activity in the visual cortex. And in fact, what we found was that psilocybin just switched off the brain. But it didn't just switch off all the brain, it switched off the brain in particular key areas, like the anterior and posterior cingulate cortex, the default mode of the brain. And what it turns out now that what psychedelics do is switch off the integral hubs of the brain and therefore allow the separate parts of the brain to do their own thing without being locked into a traditional conventional way of interacting. But more than that, we showed it switched off this part of the brain called the anterior subgenual cingulate cortex, which is a part of the brain which is overactive in depression. And we and others have shown that people often get a sense of well-being after using psychedelics. And it may be that the well-being comes because you switch off this part of the brain, which we know causes a sense of depression and distress. And in fact, many studies of antidepressant treatments have shown that that part of the brain needs to be switched off for people to get out of depression. And based on our observations, our imaging observations, and these studies, we've got funding from the British government to do a study of psilocybin and depression. But currently, we still haven't managed to overcome the UK drug regulations because the people who arbitrate on, for instance, the transfer of the drug, the production of the drug, are so tied in the regulations and so scared of falling foul of them that it's almost impossible to penetrate through this barrier of fear and opposition. There's another target for psilocybin, cluster headaches, are particularly unpleasant, the most unpleasant form of headache. Many sufferers commit suicide. When women get it, they often say it's worse than childbirth. Many people turn to use mushrooms illegally because it's the only way they can find respite. But we find that even their support groups are so terrified of breaking the law that they won't endorse research in this field because it's illegal. And I'm going to finish by talking about this study. I don't know if any of you heard about this, but last year we did a study of MDMA. We did the first, I suppose what you might call sort of sophisticated brain imaging study of MDMA. trying to mirror the research we did with psilocybin. But it was impossible to get this funded by government or by research charities. And in the end, we got it funded by television. And because they understood that if 500,000 young people use this each week in Britain, there was some relevance to society to know what the drug actually did in the brain. Whereas governments are too terrified of the media to fund this sort of research. The media itself was persuaded to fund it. And there's a guy that hosted the program, John Slade. And we did it. Yeah, we did it because we were interested in the utility of MDMA and PTSD. Now, I mean, maybe not all of you are aware of the fact, but PTSD now kills more soldiers than war. And it's going to get worse, because war has changed. Often, people fight wars without even knowing who they're fighting. They certainly have no idea why they're fighting. And they then kill themselves when they discover that there is no value in what they've done. And they often suffer and see their friends and their colleagues suffer as well. And there was a study recently published showing that in treatment-resistant PTSD, and this is quite common because PTSD is actually a very hard disorder to treat, MDMA, 2 sessions of MDMA with psychotherapy, given about 3 weeks apart, could produce quite a profound change in the MDMA-treated group. The majority went into remission. Now that is an amazing finding. And it would, it seemed to us that certainly would be interesting to explore in terms of what brain mechanisms could underpin that. Maybe it would tell us how we could do better at treating other disorders as well as PTSD. And they stayed well. So this is a transformation. This is not just suppressing symptoms, this is getting people out of the disorder. So here you have it. Here's the first study that looks at the effects of MDMA in a brain imaging study using a non-theoretical approach, so asking where in the brain does MDMA change things. Well, the first thing you see, everything's blue again. So those of you who do MR studies will know that that means, again, like with psilocybin, it's brain blood flow is switched off, brain activity is switched off. But you see there's a big difference between the sites of action of MDMA and psilocybin. MDMA tends to work subcortically. It tends to switch off the limbic system, the amygdala, the insula, those parts of the brain which are involved in fear reactions. So this is a very different profile. Again, one you could not have predicted at all from any known pharmacology of the drug. You have to do the studies to see this. And interestingly, this is what we did predict. We predicted that the psychological responses to unpleasant memories would be attenuated by MDMA. Now, these weren't patients, these were normal volunteers, but of course, everyone's been traumatized. If you ask people to dig up 5 or 6 bad memories, they can do it. And under MDMA, the bottom right-hand image there, you see that the magnitude of negative memories was attenuated by MDMA. And we think that's how it works in PTSD. Well, we know that when people use MDMA in this kind of therapy, what they're doing is allowing people to relive the memory without the overwhelming emotional response that is associated with the memory, and that which then interferes with therapy. So here's an explanation of how MDMA might be useful in PTSD. And in fact, we can go beyond that. We can actually target those parts of the brain where the effects of MDMA to attenuate emotional reactivity are most profound, and there you see them. So, from a television program, we've now gone to an understanding of the neuroscience of a drug which could be revolutionary in treating PTSD, but also a drug which we need to understand. If we're interested, as I guess hopefully you all are, because you're psychologists or psychiatrists, if you're interested in the nature of empathy, this is the only drug we know that can actually acutely produce empathy. So to my mind, studying this drug is critical to understanding the neuroscience of the psychological experiences we work with. However, because it's illegal, it's created interesting hostility in my country. There's an MP who's desperate to have our research stopped. Why was Professor Nutt allowed to use an illegal drug in a study? And this idea that because something's illegal, you cannot work with it, pervades politicians, it pervades the media, it pervades the public. There's critical reason why banning things should only be done if there's a very good reason, because banning illegality distorts thinking of most people. I'll finish now with just two other thoughts for you. The first is that I think we should be using this multi-criteria decision analysis approach to look at all sorts of drugs. Here's an example of a paper that's under review at present, where we've done it for nicotine products. And what you see here are the relative harms of different nicotine products, going on the left, cigarettes, going on the right across to the patches. And you can see that cigarettes and all cigars are much, much more harmful than other forms of tobacco, and massively more harmful than electronic cigarettes or other forms of nicotine. So we think this is a very strong argument for encouraging the liberalisation of nicotine replacement products, not just as treatments of cigarettes, but as a replacement for cigarettes. And this, some of you may have heard me going on recently about the idea of replacing alcohol. Now, I spent 25 years of my life running research into treating alcohol. I ran the America Research Ward at NIAAA for 2 years. And about 10 years ago, I realised that preventing alcoholism was going to be impossible. The drug is a very complicated drug, and the toxicity of alcohol is pervasive throughout the body. And it became obvious that we weren't ever going to win that battle. But modern neuroscience gives us an opportunity to replace alcohol. We can, in theory, produce the beneficial effects of alcohol without toxicity. And we could, in fact, even have an antidote. So you could go to your party, have fun, and then take the antidote and drive back safely. That is within the compass of modern neuroscience. The question is, will we realise that? And we'll only realise it if we have a rational approach to drugs and see that drugs can be safer than alcohol and potentially a replacement for it. So I'll stop. I'll remind you, for those of you who haven't read my book, it's a very simple introduction to the whole issue of drugs, and everything goes to this charity called the Independent Scientific Committee on Drugs, which I think is probably the only truly independent centre for providing truth about drugs and drug harms that exists in the world. And I'd be very happy for all of you to sign up to the website and hopefully follow us. Thank you very much.